There is a time for us to wander, when time is young, and so are we. The woods are greener over yonder, path is new, the world is free.
Elva Zona Heister was born in Meadow Bluff in 1876. This tiny hamlet was located in Greenbrier County in the state of West Virginia. Known as Zona to her friends, her parents were Mary and Jacob Heister. At the time of the 1880 census, Zona was listed as having 3 older brothers and 1 younger brother. Life wasn't easy in the high country of Meadow Bluff. The rocky soil wasn't much good for planting anything other than potatoes. Zona sometimes wondered about what life was like in the low country where the soil was black and rich. The farmers there could grow just about anything they wanted, including corn, tobacco, and barley. They had land to graze, big fat animals, and the money they made from selling surplus crops allowed them to live in fine, big houses. Why some of these houses even had coal-fired furnaces and steam radiators that provided heat in each room during the coldest days of the winter. In 1895, when Zona was 19 years old, she made the mistake of taking a buggy ride with a young man named George Woldridge. The two got to drinking moonshine, and before you know it, they were hugging and kissing. One thing led to another, and 9 months later, Zona had a baby out of wedlock, while Zona's father was fit to be tied. The sad reality was that George didn't have 2 pennies to rub together. He could barely take care of himself, let alone provide support for a wife and child. George managed to escape having to go through a shotgun wedding. Zona was not as lucky as George. The decent and God-fearing women of Meadow Bluff snubbed Zona as a Jezebel and a harlot. With her reputation in tatters, Zona lost hope of ever finding a husband because she was now a ruined woman.
Despair, agony on me, deep dark depression, excessive misery. If it weren't for bad luck, I'd have no luck at all. Gloom, despair, and agony on me.
In 1895, a handsome blacksmith named Aramus Stribling Shoe moved to Meadow Bluff, known as Trout to his friends. Mr. Shoe was 34 years old. He worked for James Crookshank, who owned a string of blacksmith shops throughout the area. These blacksmith shops were always situated near the main road. Their main business came from the heavy freight wagons that rolled through town, carrying coal from the northwestern part of the state, and planks and beams that had been cut just a few miles away at the St. Lawrence Boom and Lumber Company in Ronceverte. Other wagons carried goods for the general stores and bales of tobacco from local farms. At one point or another, all of these wagons needed a blacksmith to replace horseshoes or wheel rims for wagons. Although blacksmithing paid well and was a respected profession, Mr. Shoe was viewed with suspicion by many of Meadow Bluff's residents. Even though Mr. Shoe came from Droop Mountain, which was just over the Greenbrier County line, the smith was still regarded as an outsider. The fact that he had been twice married, and that each of his wives had died under mysterious circumstances, made some people nervous. His most recent wife had been 16-year-old Lucy Ann Tritt. Within 6 months of their marriage, she had died earlier that year on February 11th when Mr. Shoe had accidentally dropped a brick on her head while he was supposedly repairing the chimney to his fireplace.
Ali, my love, could you step outside for a moment?
It's quite chilly outside. Are you freezing, my dear?
I have something to give you. Could you move a bit to your right?
Is it a present? Oh Trout! You're far too kind to me.
Why anyone would be repairing a chimney in the middle of winter when one needed a fireplace to warm one's house was a complete mystery that left a lot of Meadow Bluff residents scratching their heads. In addition to being an outsider and a widower, Mr. Shue had a criminal past. He had served 2 years in a county jail for having stolen a horse in Pocahontas County. Despite all of the strikes against him, Sona paid this information no heed. When she gazed at the handsome Smith with yearning eyes, instead of seeing a problem, she saw an opportunity. Unlike George, Erasmus had a good-paying job. If he had a checkered past, so what? It wasn't as though she hadn't had her own issues with the town gossips. Although Mrs. Heaster did not approve of the Smith, Sona married him in November of that year, at the Methodist Church at Livesey's Mill. Since Mr. Crookshank had taken a liking to Trout Shue, he gave Trout a new job in rich lands. The job was 14 miles away from Meadow Bluff, but it came with a large house. As Sona happily said about setting up her new home, she looked forward to starting a new life with the handsome Smith. Sona Shue's marriage lasted for about 2 months. On January 22 in 1896, an 11-year-old boy named Anderson Jones arrived at the Shue residence. Given how much money Trout was now making, the boy had been hired to help Sona around the house. After knocking on the door, young Anderson shuffled his feet on the front porch. It was bitterly cold outside. He hadn't walked all this way just to turn around and go home empty-handed. Working for the Shues paid 10 cents an hour. While 10 cents might not seem like very much in today's world, in 1896, a dime could buy a dozen eggs and a stick of candy. You could get a pound of coffee for 10 cents or a cone of brown sugar, a single piece of licorice, and a stick of candy. When nobody answered the door, Anderson boldly put his hand on the doorknob and opened it.
"Hello? Mrs. Shue? It's me. It's Anderson."
He called as he entered the house. There was no answer. Here's where things get a bit strange. Common folklore tells that the child found the lifeless body at the foot of the stairs. As it turns out, a 1910 interview with Anderson Jones reveals the truth of what happened. Instead of a body, the child found a trail of blood starting at the foot of the stairs. When Anderson followed it to the dining room, he came across a shocking sight. Mrs. Shue was lying on the dining room floor. Her unblinking, sightless eyes told the young boy that she was quite dead. Anderson screamed and ran home as fast as he could. As he neared his home, his mother could hear his sobbing, hysterical screams. After rushing outside and learning what had happened, the two ran to get the doctor. As they hurried to the doctor's office, Anderson saw his Aunt Martha, who was calling to them from across a cold, barren field. After shouting the news about Mrs. Shue's death to his aunt, the woman picked up her skirts and ran to the smithery to tell Trout the sad news. Trout reached his home much more quickly than the doctor did. When the doctor reached the house, he found that the body had been moved. Trout had taken his wife to their bedroom, where he had washed the body and put her in a clean dress. Not only had he dressed his wife, but he had also taken the time to tie a scarf around Sona's neck. He told the doctor that he wanted his wife to look her best when the undertakers arrived, and that the scarf she was wearing had been her very favorite. The doctor was not able to examine the body for a cause of death. When he tried to approach the corpse, Trout became hysterical. The man clung to his dead wife, crying bitter tears. It was clear to the doctor that Trout had loved his new bride. Since Zona had been pregnant, the blood suggested that she had had a miscarriage and had bled to death. Given how upset Trout was over the loss of his wife and unborn child, the doctor decided to tell the sheriff that this had been an accidental death. The doctor sent a rider to tell Zona's parents that their daughter was dead. They arrived the next day and Zona's funeral was held on the following morning. During the funeral service, Trout was protective of his dead wife. Not only would he not allow mourners to closely approach the body, but he had also laid a pillow in the coffin to cushion her head. Zona's body was laid to rest in the graveyard of Seoul Methodist Church. Her obituary, which appeared in the Greenbrier Independent, read, Mrs. E.Z. Shu, wife of E.S. Shu, died at her home in the Richlands, this county, on Sunday last, the 24th, aged 22 years. Mrs. Shu was a daughter of Mr. Hedges Heister, of Meadow Bluff District. Mr. Shu formerly lived in Pocahontas County. The burial of Zona Shu should have been a sad ending to what had been a hard and challenging life for the young woman. As it turned out, her death was only the start of the final chapter of this story.
Well, I followed close behind her, tried to hold up and be brave, but I could not hide my sorrow when they laid her in the grave. Will the circle be unbroken by and by, Lord, by and by? There's a better home awaiting in the sky, Lord, in the sky.
Zona's mother, Mrs. Heister, was suspicious over what had happened, knowing that he had been previously married and that his last two brides had come to an untimely end. She began praying for her daughter's spirit to return so that she could learn the truth about what happened. One night, as she lay in bed, there was a bright light in her bedroom. A silhouette of a woman's figure appeared. When the light faded, Mrs. Heister saw the ghostly figure of her daughter. Speaking in a voice that sounded as though it had been spoken at the end of a long tunnel, Zona told the sad story of her death. Having grown up in a poor farming family, she had made the mistake of cleaving to her family's ways by making a thick vegetable stew with creamed corn and bread for her husband's dinner. When Trout saw what she had made for him, he became enraged. Dinner is nowadays what we would call lunch. It was the biggest meal of the day because working men needed strength to do their jobs. When Trout saw that he had been given a dinner of just vegetables with no meat, he lost his temper. He had wanted meat for dinner, and plenty of it. The fact that he hadn't mentioned this to his wife wasn't his fault because he said that she should have known. After grabbing her by the throat, he squeezed so hard that he broke her neck. Her broken neck was the reason why he tied a scarf around it and would not let anyone approach the body. It was also the reason why he had put a cushion in the coffin. Instead of being a final loving gesture from her husband, the cushion was used to prop up her head so that the mourners wouldn't know that she had a broken neck. Having shared the story of what had happened to her, Zona's ghost faded out of sight. In the morning, Mrs. Heister visited the county prosecutor, John Alfred Preston. While Mr. Preston was sympathetic, he told Zona's mother that he couldn't arrest anyone, let alone charge them, on the word of a ghost. To make a murder charge stick, he would have to have proof that Zona had actually been murdered. The prosecutor was quite startled when Mrs. Heister gave him permission to have the body exhumed from the grave. Digging up bodies was not something that people did because of the widespread belief that the dead should be left at peace. While the prosecutor initially refused to have Zona's body dug up, he did agree to open an investigation. When the town doctor told him that Trout Shu had refused to allow him to examine the body, he decided to order the exhumation of Zona's corpse. Although Mr. Shu argued against the desecration of his wife's grave, The prosecutor made him come to the graveyard, since the law required an immediate family member to be present during an exhumation. 1 month after Zona had been buried, her body was disinterred. Mr. Shu, who was visibly nervous, spent the time whittling. The prosecutor noticed that he was very pale. Despite the cold, he was also sweating. After disinterring the coffin, the body was taken to the local schoolhouse for examination. 3 doctors, including the town doctor, were present to examine the corpse. The body was found to be in excellent condition because the cold weather had kept the corpse from decomposing. It did not take long for these medical professionals to find that Zona's neck had been broken. Trout had squeezed his wife's neck so hard that his hands had left 2 discolored handprints around Zona's neck. Trout was immediately placed under arrest prior to being put in the county jail at Lewisburg. Since the county did not have a judge had to come from the state capital in Charleston. Trout's trial began in June, over 6 months after Zona had died. The trial was held in the county courthouse at Lewisburg. Trout was defended by James Gardner, the county's first black attorney. The defense claimed that Zona's neck had been broken post-mortem, and that this had either occurred while Trout was dressing the body, or while it lay sliding about inside its casket, as the wheels of the wagon carrying the body were jostled and bumped for 15 miles along the county's poorly maintained roads. The defense attorney put Mrs. Heister on the stand in an effort to undermine her story about how the ghost of Zona Shu had come to her with a tell-all story about how she had died. This effort failed because Mrs. Heister was completely believable. The jury returned with a verdict within 1 hour. Trout Shu was found guilty of first-degree murder. When the judge announced his sentence, there was a lot of angry grumbling in the courtroom. Instead of an expected death sentence, Trout was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was sent to the state prison in Moundsville, which was one of the most violent prisons in the United States. He died 3 years later after the prison suffered an outbreak of measles, mumps, and pneumonia. Zona's death has been commemorated by both a tombstone as well as a sign for having been the only ghost to have ever solved her own murder. Did Zona really appear to her mother? If she didn't appear to her mother, how did her mother know about her daughter's broken neck? Before ending this latest installment, I thought I would mention that Ancestry.com is offering a free subscription to anyone who can tell them what happened to Zona's child. Nobody knows where this child was born or what happened to it following its birth.
If you liked this video and would like to see more content, please click on the like and subscribe buttons.